Lyran Kares stood at the center of the polished metallic room, her long coat swirling faintly with the movement of the ship's artificial air currents. The Vrail envoy's expression remained as calm as the still surface of a lake, even though tensions were high. Her diplomatic mission had hit yet another wall, courtesy of the human delegation. Across from her, Daniel Reyes leaned on the edge of a data console, a lopsided grin softening the edge of his otherwise sharp features. His casual posture was at odds with the situation. "Come on, we're not asking for miracles here," he said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of exasperation. "Just a mutual deal that's fair to both sides." Lyran's slit-pupiled eyes flicked toward him, her calm demeanor betraying nothing. "Your definition of fair appears heavily weighted toward your side." Once again, the humans attempt to claim resources that were clearly marked by Vrail survey teams decades ago. "Lyran," Daniel said, pushing off the console and walking to her, his boots clinking softly against the deck. "You know as well as I do that the current boundary lines are outdated. We could fight over this until we're both too old to care, or we could reach a compromise that benefits both parties. Isn't that why we're here in the first place?" She tilted her head slightly. "It would be easier to take your arguments seriously if your species didn't have a history of breaking agreements." Before he could respond, the ship's alarm blared, and the room's lights shifted to a deep, unsettling red. A synthetic voice echoed through the chamber, "Unknown vessel approaching. All personnel to emergency stations." "What the hell?" Daniel muttered. He darted to the nearest console, fingers flying over the interface. Lyran stepped closer, her movements quick and deliberate. "Is it one of yours?" she asked. "No," Daniel said after a few seconds. "This doesn't match any human or Vrail signatures. Someone else is getting involved." The ship shuddered, the lights flickering. Lyran's jaw tightened. "They're firing on us." "Looks that way," Daniel replied. "Not much chance they're here to join the peace talks." The room lurched as another hit rocked the ship. Lyran grabbed the edge of the console to steady herself, her coat swaying as she leaned forward. "We need to get to the escape pods." "Agreed," Daniel said, already heading for the nearest hatch. He paused and glanced back at her. "You trust me, right?" "I have little choice," she replied dryly. He grinned. "I'll take that as a yes. Come on." The pair sprinted through the narrow corridors, the ship's walls groaning with each blast from the unknown attacker. They passed panicked crew members and injured diplomats. Daniel slid to a stop at an intersection, pulling Lyran behind a support beam as a nearby bulkhead exploded, sending shrapnel cascading down the hall. "Looks like we're not the only ones in trouble," he said, glancing at her. Lyran nodded once. "We'll save the debate over who's to blame for later. For now, let's get out of here." They navigated their way through the chaos, Daniel leading and Lyran covering their flank. As they reached the pod bay, the ship bucked violently. Daniel stumbled, and Lyran caught his arm, steadying him. "Thanks," he said, offering her a brief, surprised smile. "Let's keep moving," she replied. The escape pods were small, cylindrical crafts lined up along the bulkhead. Daniel approached the control panel, his fingers deftly typing in commands. "We're in luck one pod still has life support and enough fuel to get us to the nearest trade station." "Luck or human oversight?" Lyran asked, raising an eyebrow. He smirked. "A bit of both, maybe." They climbed into the pod and strapped themselves into the narrow seats. As the hatch sealed, the ship around them shuddered again, this time more violently. Daniel cursed under his breath and hit the release switch. The pod shot out into the void, leaving the besieged ship behind. The small craft rattled as it passed through the debris field. Lyran watched through the viewport, her gaze fixed on the bright flashes of weapons fire in the distance. "Doesn't look like they're after just the ship," Daniel muttered. "They want everyone on board." "Whoever they are," Lyran said, her tone cold, "they have no regard for diplomacy." "Right now, I'm more concerned with keeping us alive," Daniel replied. He adjusted the controls, stabilizing the pod's course. "You think your people will send a rescue?" "Not likely," Lyran admitted. "They'll consider the situation too volatile." And if they believe I'm dead, they'll have no reason to risk more lives. Then I guess we're on our own, Daniel said, glancing at her. It appears so, she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. For a few moments, the only sound was the faint hum of the pod's systems. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I don't suppose you've got any ideas. I am a diplomat, not an engineer, Lyran said, her voice edged with dry humor. I suggest we rely on your expertise. Flattering, he said with a chuckle, but we're going to need more than that. She studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. Your people have a reputation for resourcefulness. Prove it. Daniel grinned. Challenge accepted. As he set to work tweaking the pod's systems, Lyran leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. She didn't trust humans, not fully, but this Daniel, had so far proven himself capable. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance they could get through this. Together. The faint blue glow of the pod's interior lights cast shadows across Daniel's face as he squinted at a flickering console. His hands moved quickly, rerouting power and scanning through error messages. Lyran sat across from him, her arms crossed and her eyes following his every move. The cramped interior of the escape pod forced them into an uneasy proximity, and the only sound was the soft hum of failing machinery and the occasional metallic groan from the pod's damaged hull. This thing's in worse shape than I thought, Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. Looks like the secondary oxygen filters are completely shot. And the primary system, well, it's not exactly in peak condition. What does that mean? Lyran asked, her voice calm but firm. Are we going to run out of air? Not if I can fix it, Daniel said. But it's going to take some time. And I'd feel a lot better if we weren't drifting aimlessly out here. Lyran raised a sharp brow. I thought you had a destination in mind. I did, he admitted, glancing at her. But the NAV system's down, and I can't get a clear reading on where we are. Not yet, anyway. Then what's your plan? Simple, Daniel said with a faint grin. Fix the oxygen, get the NAV working, and figure out where the hell we are. In that order. And if you fail? He looked at her, his expression serious now. I don't plan on failing. Lyran regarded him silently for a moment. She wasn't accustomed to relying on others, least of all humans. But she had to admit reluctantly that Daniel seemed capable. And in their current situation, she had little choice but to trust his skills. What can I do to help? She asked finally. Daniel's eyebrows lifted. You're offering to help? That's a surprise. I'm a diplomat, she said, her tone dry. I adapt to circumstances. Well, Daniel said, leaning back against the console, you can start by passing me that toolbox. And maybe try not to look so skeptical while you're at it. Lyran reached for the small metal box strapped to the wall. She handed it to him, her expression as neutral as ever. Skepticism is a survival trait. I'd suggest you adopt it. Fair point, he said, popping the box open and pulling out a set of tools. But a little optimism never hurt anyone either. Optimism without reason is a fool's errand, she replied. Good thing I've got a reason, then, Daniel said, flashing her a quick grin. You'll see. Give me an hour, and we'll have a stable oxygen supply again. True to his word, Daniel worked quickly. He disassembled a section of the pod's inner wall, revealing a tangled mess of wires and tubing. Lyran watched as he meticulously replaced damaged components, his movements quick and confident. How did you learn all this? She asked after a while. Engineering background, he said without looking up. Worked on a lot of older ships before joining the diplomatic corps. Turns out, knowing how to keep a bucket of bolts running can come in handy. And yet you chose diplomacy, she said, her tone curious. It wasn't exactly a choice, he admitted. I was a last-minute replacement for the regular engineer. Guess I drew the short straw. Lyran tilted her head slightly. So you're here by chance? Pretty much, Daniel said with a shrug. But hey, that's life, right? You roll with it. She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before turning back to the viewport. Outside, the vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly, dotted with distant stars. The silence felt heavy, pressing down on them even more than the limited confines of the pod. "I'll need your help with the next part," Daniel said after a while, breaking the silence. Lyran turned back to him. "What do you need me to do? See that panel over there?" He pointed to a small access hatch on the opposite wall. "I need you to open it and tell me what you see inside. Specifically, I need you to find the conduit labeled O2 primary and make sure it's not burnt out." Lyran moved to the panel and knelt down, pulling it open with some effort. Inside was a cluster of cables and conduits, each marked with a small identifier. "I see it," she said. "Great. Is the insulation intact?" "Yes, it appears undamaged." "Perfect," Daniel said, still working on his end. "Now, when I say so, I need you to cut the power to that conduit for exactly 10 seconds, then restore it." "Got it?" "I understand." "Good," he said. "On my mark, 3, 2, 1, go." Lyran complied, her movements precise. The lights in the pod flickered for a moment before stabilizing. "Nice work," Daniel said, giving her a quick nod. "Looks like we've got the primary system online again. That should buy us enough time to figure out our next move." Lyran closed the panel and stood. "And what is our next move?" "I'll try to get the NAV system back online," he said. "Once we know where we are, we can plot a course to the nearest trade port. Hopefully, we can find someone willing to help us there." "And if they're not willing?" "Then we convince them," Daniel said with a faint grin. "One way or another." Lyran shook her head slightly. "Your species' reliance on improvisation is interesting. Call it what you want," he said, returning his attention to the console. "It works." For the next several hours, the two worked side by side in the dimly lit pod. Daniel explained the basics of the systems they were repairing, and Lyran, despite her initial reluctance, proved to be a quick learner. The small victories along the way, restoring partial power, stabilizing life support, helped ease the tension between them. By the time they managed to get a faint navigational signal, they were both exhausted but more in sync than either would have expected. "There," Daniel said, leaning back with a sigh. "We've got a heading. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing." Lyran examined the readout. "This trade port, it's neutral territory?" "More or less," Daniel said. "It's not exactly a friendly neighborhood, but it's the best chance we've got." She nodded. "Then let's hope your optimism isn't misplaced." Daniel chuckled. "You're starting to sound a little optimistic yourself." "Don't count on it," she said, her tone as dry as ever. But as the pod adjusted course and the first faint glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon, neither of them could deny the strange camaraderie that had begun to form between them. The trade port loomed ahead like a city floating in the void. Its tangled architecture of interconnected spheres, spindly walkways, and angular docks shimmered under the distant light of a nearby star. As the pod approached, Daniel guided it toward one of the open bays. The closer they got, the more it became clear this wasn't a well-maintained hub of commerce. It was a ramshackle meeting point for smugglers, independent traders, and anyone else who preferred to operate off the radar. "Not exactly what I'd call a welcoming sight," Daniel said, his hands steady on the controls. "It's no worse than some of the ports my people have used," Lyran replied, though her sharp gaze scanned every detail. "Still, I'd suggest caution. Places like this tend to attract those looking to exploit vulnerability." Daniel glanced at her. "Noted. Let's just keep a low profile, grab what we need, and get out." The pod touched down with a jarring thud inside one of the trade port's docking bays. The moment the engines powered down, a thin layer of frost crept along the interior windows, a reminder that the pod's systems weren't holding up as well as they hoped. "We'll need parts for the air regulator, a replacement NAV interface, and probably some power cells," Daniel said as he unstrapped himself from the seat. "Not to mention food and water. I doubt we're going to find it all in one place, so we'll have to split up." Lyran frowned slightly. "Separating could increase the risk of exposure. If someone recognizes either of us." I know, Daniel said. But we don't have much of a choice. The longer we're here, the more likely someone will take notice. Let's keep comms open and meet back here in an hour. Deal? She nodded. Agreed. If either of us encounters trouble, we signal immediately. Exactly, he said, giving her a quick, reassuring smile. Stay sharp. They stepped out of the pod and into the shadowy confines of the tradeport's docking bay. A pungent blend of engine oil, recycled air, and some unidentifiable metallic tang filled their lungs as they moved toward the open corridors beyond. Daniel took the lead, weaving through the cluttered maze of stalls, vendors, and repair stations. The atmosphere inside the tradeport was chaotic. Hawkers shouted in a dozen different languages, alien merchants displayed questionable wares on rusted tables, and groups of rough-looking crew members exchanged furtive glances. Daniel kept his head down, but his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings. I'll check the repair bays for parts, he told Lyran. You try the central market, see if you can find any fresh provisions. If there's anything out of the ordinary, call it in. Understood, she said, her voice steady. Without another word, they split up, each disappearing into the bustling crowd. Daniel made his way toward the nearest repair bay, his movements smooth and practiced. He approached a stall operated by a squat, multi-limbed creature with leathery skin and an abundance of tools strapped to its body. Looking for some air regulator components, Daniel said, his tone casual. The vendor tilted its head, one bulbous eye blinking slowly. Depends on what you've got to trade. Daniel pulled out a small data stick. How about schematics for a human-engineered modular power relay system? The vendor's eyes lit up, literally, they glowed faintly. Interesting. Let me see those specs. As the creature examined the data stick, Daniel kept his attention on the bustling bay behind him. People came and went, some haggling over parts, others exchanging what were clearly stolen goods. No one seemed to pay him much attention, but he remained alert. Meanwhile, Lyran navigated the central market, her tall, lithe frame making her stand out among the shorter, stockier beings that dominated the area. She approached a stall piled high with crates of foodstuffs, some recognizable, others less so. I'm looking for preserved rations, she said to the vendor, a broad-shouldered humanoid with metallic tattoos running down his neck. Depends on your currency, the vendor grunted. Lyran produced a small vial containing a pale blue liquid. Vrail nutrient extract. Highly concentrated and lasts for months. The vendor inspected the vial, his face lighting up. This'll do. Take your pick. She selected a crate of rations, but before she could leave, she noticed a pair of figures lingering at the edge of the market. Their mismatched armor and hidden faces suggested mercenaries, and they seemed to be watching her closely. Reyes, she murmured into her communicator. Go ahead, Daniel's voice crackled back. I may have attracted some unwanted attention. There are 2 individuals tailing me. They appear to be mercenaries. Got it, Daniel replied. Keep calm. I'll finish up here and head your way. Just stay out in the open and don't make any sudden moves. I'm not certain they'll give me the luxury of time, Lyran said, her tone cool but tense. Then I'll move fast, Daniel said. Hang tight. He quickly concluded his deal with the vendor and headed toward the central market. As he arrived, he spotted Lyran standing near a row of crates, pretending to examine a piece of equipment. The 2 mercenaries were closer now, their postures growing more aggressive. Daniel stepped up beside her, his voice low. They're moving in. Any ideas? They'll likely confront us soon, she said. Perhaps if we. Before she could finish, the mercenaries closed the gap. One of them spoke, his voice distorted by a voice modulator. You too. Step away from the market. Now. Daniel held his hands out in a gesture of calm. Easy there. We're just passing through, not looking for trouble. Not looking for trouble, huh? The second mercenary said, his weapon half-drawn. Funny, because you're worth a lot of credits to the right buyer. Lyran's eyes narrowed. Who sent you? That's none of your business, the first mercenary replied. Now, are you coming quietly, or do we have to do this the hard way? Daniel leaned closer to Lyran, his voice just above a whisper. Follow my lead. Before the mercenaries could react, Daniel grabbed a nearby crate and shoved it toward them, sending one stumbling backward. Run, he shouted. He and Lyran darted through the crowded market, weaving between startled vendors and bystanders. The mercenaries gave chase, shouting commands as they pushed through the throng. This way. Daniel called, grabbing Lyran's arm and pulling her toward a narrow side corridor. They sprinted down the dimly lit passage, the sounds of pursuit growing louder. As they rounded a corner, Daniel spotted a heavy piece of machinery on a wheeled cart. He shoved it into the corridor behind them, blocking their pursuers' path. That'll slow them down, he said, breathing hard. Not for long, Lyran replied. We need to get back to the pod. Agreed, Daniel said. Let's move. They hurried back toward the docking bay, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. By the time they reached the pod, the sounds of pursuit had faded. Daniel slapped the control panel, and the pod's hatch opened with a hiss. Get inside. I'll lock us down. Lyran climbed in, and Daniel followed, sealing the hatch behind them. He fell into the pilot's seat, pulling up a diagnostic screen. We don't have enough parts to make a full repair, but we can get the system stable enough for a short jump. Once we're out of here, we can regroup and figure out our next steps. Lyran took the co-pilot's seat, her gaze focused and steady. Behind. For now, they were safe, but they both knew the real challenges lay ahead. The pod settled into the trade route's traffic lane like a leaf caught in a river's current. Daniel adjusted their trajectory with careful precision, hands steady on the controls. The aftermath of their escape still lingered between him and Lyran. Their silence wasn't hostile, far from it, but neither spoke for a long stretch, the hum of the engines the only sound. Finally, Daniel exhaled. I don't think those mercenaries were random. No, Lyran agreed, her voice calm yet edged with thoughtfulness. Their actions were far too deliberate. They knew who we were. Which means someone's pulling strings, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair. Someone who knew we'd be there, knew what we'd be trying to do. But why send them to grab us instead of just taking us out when we were at the trade port? Capture holds more strategic value, Lyran said. If we were taken alive, whoever hired them would have leverage over me, over the humans, possibly even over my government. Killing us would achieve nothing but silencing us, and I doubt that was their primary goal. Daniel shook his head. Sounds more complicated than I'd like. I'm not much for political games. Give me a circuit board and some duct tape, and I'm good to go. This cloak and dagger stuff, though. You handle the engineering, Lyran said, a hint of a smile in her voice. I'll manage the politics. Deal, Daniel replied, grinning despite himself. The pod continued its slow journey along the trade route. The sparse stars outside the viewport provided little comfort. Daniel focused on fine-tuning the pod's damaged systems while Lyran monitored the communication channels. Despite their escape from the trade port, the threat wasn't over. Whoever had sent the mercenaries would undoubtedly try again. Do you think your people will send reinforcements? Daniel asked after a while. Lyran hesitated. Unlikely. The Vrel government tends to avoid unnecessary risks. If they believe I am still alive, they may eventually send an envoy to investigate. But that will take time we may not have. So we're still on our own, Daniel said. Nothing new there, I guess. You seem unusually calm about that, she said, glancing at him. He shrugged. Like I said, I'm used to fixing things with whatever's at hand. We'll make it work. Lyran's gaze lingered on him for a moment before returning to her console. You are different from the humans I've encountered before. I'll take that as a compliment, Daniel said with a small smile. Perhaps it is, she said, her tone unreadable. For a while, they continued working in silence. Daniel checked and rechecked the life support systems, making minor adjustments to ensure their oxygen supply remained stable. Lyran studied the star charts, searching for a safe haven where they could regroup and plan their next move. Here, she said at last, pointing to a distant system on the display. This sector has a neutral station that doesn't require identification. It's not ideal, but it's our best option for now. Sounds good, Daniel said. Setting course. As the pod adjusted its heading, Lyran turned her chair to face him. Daniel, what do you think will happen once we reach the station? Do you truly believe we can remain anonymous long enough to repair the pod and move on? I think we'll figure it out when we get there, he said. We don't have many options, but that's never stopped me before. That attitude is peculiar, she said. You always seem so certain that things will work out, even when the odds are against you. Daniel paused, his hands hovering over the controls. I guess it's just how I'm wired. You keep moving, keep trying, and eventually, something gives. It's not about certainty, it's about not giving up before you find the solution. Lyran regarded him thoughtfully. Perhaps there is merit in that approach. Trust me, Daniel said with a grin, you'd be surprised how often it works. She didn't respond right away, but there was a slight softening in her expression. For the first time since they'd met, Daniel thought he saw a flicker of genuine trust in her eyes. As they continued toward the neutral station, their dynamic began to shift. The constant stress and danger forced them to rely on each other more and more. Daniel found himself not only respecting Lyran's intelligence and composure but also appreciating her insight and calm approach to problem-solving. In turn, Lyran seemed to recognize that Daniel's seemingly reckless optimism wasn't blind. He had a knack for making the best out of bad situations and for finding solutions where none seemed possible. Slowly, their guarded professionalism began to give way to a tentative friendship. During one particularly quiet moment, Lyran spoke up. Tell me, Daniel, before all of this, what did you imagine yourself doing? If you had not been on that diplomatic mission, where would you be now? Daniel leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. Probably on some deep space mining rig, patching up old freighters and making sure they didn't fall apart before their next haul. Nothing glamorous. Just a lot of grease and duct tape. And you would have been content with that? He considered the question. I don't know if content is the right word. But I guess it was simple. Fix something, get it running again, and call it a day. No politics, no intrigue. Just straight-up problem-solving. Lyran tilted her head. Perhaps that simplicity is why you adapt so well to these situations. You approach each challenge as though it were a mechanical failure, something to be fixed, rather than something to fear. Maybe, Daniel said. But what about you? Before you became a diplomat, what did you want to do? She hesitated, as though the question caught her off guard. My path was chosen for me at an early age. I come from a family with a long history of public service. Becoming an envoy was not a choice, it was a duty. Did you ever wish for something else? Daniel asked. Her gaze drifted to the viewport, the stars reflected in her eyes. Perhaps. But wishes are irrelevant. What matters is what we do with the roles we are given. I guess that's one way to look at it, Daniel said. She glanced at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. You have a curious way of making me think differently, Daniel. It is unsettling, but not unwelcome. I'll take that as a compliment, he said with a chuckle. For the first time since their escape, they shared a brief moment of genuine camaraderie. It wasn't just the shared danger or the forced proximity, it was the understanding that, despite their differences, they were in this together. And as the pod continued its journey, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that, against all odds, they might just make it out of this alive, together. The neutral station came into view like a small, cluttered island in the void. Its outer hull was covered in mismatched panels, patchwork repairs, and glowing neon signs that flickered erratically. The kind of place that relied on anonymity as much as its patched-together infrastructure. Well, it's not pretty, Daniel said, hands steady on the pod's controls, but it'll have to do. Looks can be deceiving, Lyran replied. Sometimes, the most unassuming places offer the best opportunities. Let's hope this is one of those times. Daniel nodded, guiding the pod toward one of the station's docking arms. As they entered the crowded landing bay, the sound of activity immediately flooded their ears, clanking metal, voices in a dozen languages, the hiss of pressurized air. "Keep a low profile," Daniel said. "No flashy moves, no drawing attention. We get what we need, and we're out." "Understood," Lyran said. They exited the pod, their boots clanking on the gridded metal floor. Around them, station workers hauled crates, checked manifests, and argued over pricing. A pair of large alien dockhands were gesturing animatedly at a small human merchant, their voices rising over the din. "Great," Daniel muttered. "Just our kind of crowd." "I'll handle negotiations," Lyran said. "Your knack for improvisation may be useful in a pinch, but diplomacy requires a more nuanced touch." "Fair enough," Daniel said. "I'll stick to keeping an eye on the exits and making sure no one sneaks up on us." They made their way toward the repair quarter, a section of the station that looked more like a scavenger's market than a legitimate supply depot. The stalls were crowded with parts, some pristine, some obviously salvaged from derelict vessels. "Where do you think we'll find the regulator components?" Daniel asked. Lyran pointed toward a stall manned by a four-armed alien. "There. I recognize some of those assemblies. Let me do the talking." She approached the vendor, her posture calm and assured. "I'm in need of a primary oxygen regulator module, compatible with a Class C escape pod. Do you have one available?" The vendor tilted its oblong head, its many eyes blinking in sequence. "You've got credits? Or trade goods?" Lyran produced a small data device. "This contains detailed star charts of uncharted regions. Quite valuable for those looking to expand their operations." The vendor leaned forward, examining the device closely. After a few moments, it nodded. "Fair trade. I've got a regulator in the back." "One moment." Daniel watched the exchange from a short distance away, his eyes scanning the surrounding stalls. He noticed a couple of figures lurking near a stack of crates, their movements subtle but suspicious. "Lyran," he said quietly, stepping closer. "We've got company. 2, maybe 3, near the crates. I think they're watching us." Lyran glanced back toward the vendor. "Let's conclude our business quickly, then." When the vendor returned with the regulator module, Lyran accepted it with a curt nod. "Pleasure doing business." Likewise, the vendor replied, already turning its attention to another customer. "Let's move," Lyran said, motioning toward the exit. They made their way back toward the docking bay, but the suspicious figures began following at a distance. Daniel caught Lyran's eye and nodded toward a side corridor. "This way," he said. "Let's lose them in the maintenance passages." They slipped into the narrow corridor, the hum of the station's machinery filling the space. Pipes and conduits lined the walls, and dim emergency lights cast long shadows. The sound of their pursuers' footsteps echoed faintly behind them. "What's the plan?" Lyran asked. "We keep moving, double back if we need to, and try to shake them," Daniel said. "I'd rather not fight unless we have to." "You'd prefer to avoid confrontation," she said, a note of curiosity in her voice. "I'm an engineer, not a soldier," he replied. "I can patch a hull breach or rebuild a power core, but I'm not exactly trained for hand-to-hand combat." "Noted," Lyran said, her expression unreadable. As they turned a corner, Daniel stopped abruptly. Ahead, a dead end loomed, a sealed maintenance hatch with no way around. "Well, so much for the plan," he muttered. Footsteps grew louder behind them. Lyran stepped forward, her hand resting on the small blade she kept concealed. "They'll catch up any second," she said. "Prepare yourself." "Great," Daniel said, glancing around for anything he could use as a makeshift weapon. Just another day in paradise. The first figure appeared at the corner, a humanoid wearing a mismatched assortment of armor plates. The figure raised a weapon, but Lyran was faster. With a fluid motion, she stepped in, disarmed him, and pushed him back into the second pursuer. "Not bad," Daniel said, catching his breath. "Keep moving," Lyran said, her voice firm. "They'll recover quickly." They rushed past the stunned pursuers and took another corridor, this one leading back toward the main concourse. The station's crowded hallways offered some cover, but it was clear their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. "If we can make it to the pod, we can seal ourselves inside and take off before they catch up," Daniel said. "Do you think the pod's systems are stable enough for immediate departure?" "Barely," Daniel admitted. "But it's our best shot." As they entered the docking bay, Daniel sprinted ahead to start the launch sequence. Lyran stayed close, keeping an eye on their surroundings. The pursuers were nowhere in sight, but she knew better than to assume they'd given up. Daniel climbed into the pod and powered up the engines. "Come on, Lyran. We've got to go." She moved quickly, stepping inside just as the hatch began to close. The pod's engines roared to life, and the docking bay walls fell away as they launched into open space. "We made it," Daniel said, leaning back in his seat. "For now," Lyran said. "But I suspect they'll follow us. We need to stay one step ahead." "We will," Daniel said with a small smile. "We've got a good team." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Yes. We do." As the pod slipped into the stars, Daniel and Lyran exchanged a glance. The journey ahead was uncertain, but they both knew that as long as they worked together, they stood a chance.